Welcome back to 50/50 Day, and we are talking about gender equity and how it affects both women and men. Right now we've got Jack Myers, the author of books including The Future of Men, and he's also the founder of the Future of Men movement. A documentary film producer, he's received an Academy and Emmy Award nominations for Hank Aaron, Chasing the Dream. He's also the founder of MediaVillage.com. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's great to be here. It's an honor to be a part of 50/50 Day.
Yeah, well, your work is so in line with this topic. And so you talk about a lot of issues around men and boys, and this idea that as gender norms have shifted, we have opened up space for girls to be raised differently. But What about boys? What do we all need to do as boys are seeking to define themselves?
Well, the women's movement has been so successful over the last several decades in really educating young women about the potential, the opportunities. They've been consistently encouraged to advance their careers, focus on their lives, and to really tear down the negative patriarchal realities that have confronted society for generations. At the same time, young men especially have been used by the mixed messages they're receiving. On one hand, they grow up hearing, big boys don't cry, be a real man, man up, toughen up, to be sexually assertive and aggressive, and many often inappropriately. And then at the same time, they're learning, and most young men have become supporters of equality, of feminism. In fact, a third of men under 25, young men under 25, call themselves a feminist. But we've also created what I call a lean out generation. The Gen Z have really become confused, conflicted, and confronted by this challenge between the norms of patriarchy and what they see as the future of men, which is to be more vulnerable, be more collaborative, and to not be a part of the old boys network. So they grow up with that, and then they go into the workforce, and they're confronted in many ways by a continuation of the old boys network.
Yeah, your work, you've written about how women need to help define this pathway for men. And of course, women and men always influence each other. But one thing I was struck by this election season, because I'm generally a political reporter, is how masculinity came up as a thread in political decision making and in questions of how people viewed themselves. Obviously people viewing themselves through the lens of masculinity is common, but it really came to the fore in some way during the election as people look to politics to validate masculinity. So how do you begin? Let's say that someone really wants to keep a traditional masculinity, which there's many aspects of that are fine, but one that is patriarchal in the sense of not really making space for women and not making space for boys and other men to be different. How do you start a conversation about that?
It's really difficult to start a conversation. And one of my book came out just a year ago, just as the election cycle was really heating up. And I wrote a number of pieces really focused on the success and popularity of both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And I was pointing out to the Hillary Clinton campaign that it was very important that they identify a new political movement focused on getting away from the traditional politics, and instead of advertising in a negative context against Donald Trump, to embrace his supporters and the causes and issues that they were identifying. And the problem is that men, and especially young men, felt that they were getting their concerns and issues addressed by a politician who didn't necessarily reflect who they thought they were as human beings and as individuals. But their economic realities displaced their human realities and the humanism. And that's one of the challenges we're confronting, that, humanism is being put aside by political confrontation. Think about the average 22-year-old who's grown up only knowing political controversy and adversarial relationships, who are often in single-parent homes led by a woman, where there's been conflict and confrontation from a relationship point of view. In the media, which is one of the real tenets of the Future of Men movement, they've seen Homer Simpson as the most iconic TV dad of the last 2 decades, and Family Guy as Peter Griffin as being the second most iconic TV dad. They're not seeing functional families, except the Simpsons being the most functional family, but yet they're also seeing beer commercials that show misogyny and sexism and women serving men as being appropriate. They see buffoons and men as being the idiots and buffoons. Even the commercials today where you see the men with their children and being positive male role models, typically they're with their daughter. It's very rare you see a man with his young son.
I hadn't thought about that till you said it. It's quite interesting.
And there are very few positive role models that men have seen of other men, but they've seen many positive role models of women. So they identify more with women. And that's why I believe it's so important for the women's movement to really embrace young men and realize that the young men, in many ways, need them more than the young women who have had the benefits of the positive reinforcement and role models for their whole lives.
So one thing that I think about a lot that gets to this political conversation is, and I think even the media conversation, because it's partly about what do you view as possible, is the question of men who are very active caregivers, for their children or in other roles. A lot of people are having to take on elder care as their adults. And you talk a bit about why we need more men in caregiving, particularly parenting, hands-on, but there's still a cultural stigma to it, and there's evidence that a lot of men who have parental leave, which is not mandated federally, so some people do, some people don't, but the men who have parental leave don't really want to take it, and even might get a penalty in their workplace for taking it because they're seen as maybe not.
Yeah, even if their companies accept it, the other men don't. It's an interesting conversation because we talk a lot about unconscious bias. And think about the stay-at-home dad when he accompanies his working wife, and there are more and more of them, to a business event. And the first question they get is, what do you do? And the assumption when they say, well, I'm a stay-at-home dad, is that they're an out-of-work dad.
Right.
Rather than being given credit for doing what's best for their family and for their partner, there is this stigma attached to their not being a contributing economic partner. That stigma did not exist for women, and now women are, there's this whole societal conflict that's in many ways geographic, it's socioeconomic, where the woman who becomes the primary wage earner, and more than 50% of Gen Z children today have grown up in either a fatherless home or a home where the mother is the primary or equal wage earner.
Yeah.
So that reality has to shift. We have to be more supportive of the stay-at-home dad, and we have to be more supportive of the woman who is the primary wage earner and allowing her to continue to do that without stigmatizing her partner.
Yeah.
And education is another part of that, because we need to reinforce that female stigma. There's Rebecca Traister wrote about the difficulty of women finding equally educated men. Because that's going to be more and more an issue for both men and women going forward.
So when you do your work with your Future of Men organization, what do you see as a couple of the things that people can do in their own communities or among their own friends to get us to this place where both men and women can make appropriate life choices, not because of stereotypes, but because they want to, and it's healthy, and it's good for everyone around them.
There are really 4 or 5 key tenets. The first is the media, and respond when you see commercials that present inappropriate portrayal of men. Respond to those advertisers, whether it's through tweeting or through Facebook or other social media, that you don't approve of negative, misogynistic, sexist, or buffoonery in men. You're looking for positive role models. 2, education. Look at the educational system and make sure that boys are not overly criticized when they're active or, in the classroom, and that the curriculum begins to adjust to support them. Keep boys in high school. From the business point of view, when young men go into an organization or a corporation, many of those organizations have women's organizations and mentoring groups for the women. Engage the young men in those groups as well. Support stay-at-home dads. And in local communities, we also just want to really recognize the need for men to come together and have conversations about this, not in the basements of their local community center, being, where angry men gather, but to have really positive, reinforcing, and supportive organizations, whether it's in the church group, the community center, the schools, or just men getting together and open up. And when young men, when I said I'm writing a book about the future of men, their response would be, you mean we have a future? Mm-hmm. So when men say that, recognize that young men need a GPS guide. They don't like to ask for directions in life or when they're driving, and there's no GPS for careers or life or marriages and relationships. 85% of all long-term relationships that end are ended by women. And young men are confused, and they need guidance and support to understand why these relationships are ending and what they can do to improve themselves and be more positive and self-confident about who they are, and less conflicted by these societal norms that are confronting them every day.
Well, Jack Myers, thanks so much, author of Future of Men, and with the Future of Men movement, many other accomplishments in media. It sounds like we can all get on board with the agenda of building this kind of a future and this openness across gender. 50-50 Day. Thank you.
Thank you for including me in 50-50 Day.